Hello, everybody. Hello, physical people. Hello, virtual people. Actually, at some point I realized that I won't be able to speak about social affects, really. It would take too much time. So basically, the title of the presentation should probably stop after queerness, rendering visible queerness, and something social, but not necessarily social affects. Okay, my background is, or field of expertise is in queer theory, queer studies. So sort of when you put those two or three terms together, queerness and visibility and invisibility, one of the probably first ideas that would come to most people, if we could, yeah, is how queer movements, LGBT movements, and yeah, these are not exactly the same things, but many people do use them interchangeably, LGBT and queer movements or subjects. So the first idea that comes to mind very often is sort of fighting for visibility. Sort of non-normative or non-heterosexual sexualities, subjectivities, sort of fighting over history through representations, through literature, but also through political representation, fighting to get visibility. Okay, so that so the general idea would be that queer people had been invisible in the history of whatever, of culture, let's say, and they had been somehow erased, and activism, sort of academic activism, if you want, and social activism and cultural activism is primarily about sort of gaining this visibility. And I would say yes and no. Okay, so so I asked this question provocatively. Queer is all about visibility, right? Well, not quite. Okay, I'm not saying it's not, but certainly not all about visibility. And one important reservation that needs to be made, or qualification that needs to be made, is again this difference between queer and LGBT. And as we go along, I hope to make that a bit more clear. So here's an example of you know, a local example, if you want, a Polish example of fighting for visibility. Gay and lesbian visibility. One of the first truly sort of noticed, very noticeable, very publicized campaign for LGBT people in this country took place in 2003. The artist Karolina Breguła created a series of photos, two of which you see here on a billboard. The name of the campaign was "Let Them See Us." So I mean, you couldn't have a more direct reference to visibility as such. Okay, and you also see that the sort of, this is perhaps a reference to the previous session. You know, that what happens in Poland when you put up some kinds of posters in public space. They might very often get destroyed, like here. Yeah, so it hasn't changed very much, even though to a lot of people, and also to a lot of queer people, these photos are actually too mellow, too soft, too nice. Okay, sort of aesthetically pleasing, young, good-looking people holding hands, and so on. But of course, it was controversial enough for sort of the majority to destroy the posters. There was another interesting, a more interesting and more radical, in-your-face action, and it also made a direct reference to visibility. And I don't have a visual representation of that, but it was what are you staring at, you dyke, and what are you staring at, you faggot? So, you know, the use of those heavily stigmatizing words, but also there was this sort of looking at, okay, this question of visibility and how you are visible also, okay? But I'm not going into that. So I said I'd try to complicate, you know, this sort of queer and LGBT, and of course it's almost a cliche, and it is a problematic area. You know, we can't say that queer is not at all, has nothing to do with LGBT or gay and lesbian activism. Of course, it does have a lot, but at the same time, there are certain differences. So what I would say is that from the point of view of queer critique, like academic critique, social critique, and queer activism, queer would be a critique of the politics of identity, visibility, and representation, okay? Including LGBT, the so-called LGBT representations. I can tell you that one of my, I did some work on the work of Bruce LaBruce, the queer Canadian filmmaker living in Berlin, there is this organization in the United States that sort of monitors, you know, movies and media for representations of mostly, well, gay and lesbian representations, characters, and Bruce LaBruce is absolutely against them. He calls them censors. You know, he calls it censorship. He declares it's very normative, and he absolutely, you know, is against sort of following this sort of strategy for non-normative representations, where, you know, there need to be just positive images and you know, presenting kind of respectable subjectivities. So there actually exists, whether in academia, in sort of more theoretical developments, but also in, you know, in arts, in cultural production, and also in activism. There simply is in some parts of those movements, of those academic perspectives, there is this criticism of this oversimplified emphasis on visibility and representation. So sort of to go back to that campaign, let them see us, I mentioned before, I decided to try and break it down a little bit, sort of deconstruct it a little bit, to see what it's really saying, or what the assumptions are behind that sort of campaign. And I'm open for discussion, of course. So I think what stands behind that let them see us is the idea that, well, since we exist, let them see us. Okay, so we are here. This was actually one of the famous queer slogans in the United States in the 80s, 90s, in the times of ACT UP. You know, we are here, we are queer, get used to it, or get the fuck used to it. So this seems very commonsensical. Okay, we exist, we want to be seen for who we are. Okay. Yeah. So here's a little, an even more extended sort of version of that slogan, of that idea. But I've already sort of included some provocative little question. So since we of course, it's always who is we exactly, what sort of community are we talking about? And usually, it would be like the rainbow community, LGBT community, or queer community, or and they all may actually mean somewhat different things. But okay, but even assuming that we is somehow graspable, the assumption still is that we somehow pre-exist visual representation. Okay. That first the identities, the subjectivities exist, and then they demand to be seen, to be represented. Okay, since we pre-exist visual representation, well, yes, let's let them see us. Go on. However, I remember. When I was a long time ago, sort of starting to read queer theory and Judith Butler and whatnot, and things were confusing, and of course it took some time before I could grasp anything. I found this somewhere. So this wasn't sort of my discovery, but the most revealing explanation of Judith Butler's way of thinking was, and perhaps even more generally, sort of the so-called social constructionism way of thinking, was that it's a misconception that identity precedes representation. Rather, representation precedes identity. In other words, an identity is an effect of representation, not the other way around. So it was a complete reversal of this very commonsensical notion that, first the identities exist, we pre-exist somehow representation, and then we just seek this representation, whatever, on billboards, in films, in also political representation, say, whatever, in the parliament, okay? So again, so this is an important shift. So if I were again to delineate, the difference, let's say, between more queer-oriented activism and critique and more LGBT or gay and lesbian-oriented critique, the difference would be that by and large, for queer critique, identity does not precede representation, whereas for more traditional, I'm not sure if that's more traditional, but in this other perspective, it's the other way. It's the other way around. In other words, yes, identities come first, representations come second. Now, yes. Now that brings me to my musings on on visibility in general. And so I read some theory, this and that. So I read Deleuze and Guattari, and then I read Rancière and so on. And one of the very nice, very thought-provoking idea I found in Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus was actually a quote, although it wasn't even referenced, so I'm not sure where exactly Paul Klee actually wrote it, but apparently, or Paul actually, I guess, Paul Klee, apparently stated that art is not or should not be about rendering the visible, but it should be about rendering visible. Now, this is a great example for, if you teach English, it's a great example for what a difference the article can make, right? Because these two things really have very different meanings. And as you can imagine, they go along sort of similar lines, or the way I use that quote attributed to Paul Klee. It corresponds to what I said earlier about one concept where identities precede representation, and the other where representations precede identities. So rendering the visible would sort of suggest that first. The actual entities exist, and so this is kind of representational art, okay? Where so you see a cabbage, you paint a cabbage, to use, the most trivial example. So you render the visible, you render it on a piece of canvas, let's say, okay? But first, the cabbage exists there, or okay, we could also have an image of a cabbage in our head, but it's based on all the cabbages we've seen in our lives. So the thing itself exists out there, and then it gets represented. Whereas rendering visible, at least to me, connotes something quite different, because it's more of a actually creative act of, but creative act. Such that when you say you render something visible, it means you basically sort of create it. You bring it into visibility, not in the sense of it's out there and then you just represent it, but rather you change the kind of parameters of visibility. You actually create a new entity. Okay, by rendering it visible out of what? Well, out of, for Deleuze and Guattari, out of virtuality. Okay, it's I'm not going to go into details, but that's a very, very important term for Deleuze and Guattari, where sort of what we have, the reality in which we live, especially social reality, are actualizations of virtual possibilities, so to speak. Okay, so yeah, sure, we can say that there are gay people, like gay male people with a very well established identity, and there may be lesbian people with a well established identities, and other identitarian groups. Of course, we can say that, but these are only actualizations of certain virtual possibilities, so that. And the virtual realm is, of course, sort of infinite, in fact. Okay, so rendering visible is finding and kind of visualizing the virtualities that perhaps nobody has even thought about before. Okay. So I said I would connect it a little bit to Jacques Rancière, and I'm sort of losing Jacques Rancière's concept a bit loosely, I must admit. I don't want to go into the intricacies of it, but this famous term that Rancière introduced was the distribution of the visible or perceptible, or the sensible, actually, so again, you can, and he called, so, okay, let me, this one I have a piece I have written down. So through the well-known concept of the distribution of the sensible, Jacques Rancière makes a direct connection between aesthetic modes or regimes and political ones. So that's the famous thing. Aesthetics and politics are very close to each other, and what connects them is this division of the visible. How much time do I have left? So that I know. Yes. Oh. Okay. This distribution of the I'll try to wrap up in 4 minutes. Okay. The distribution of the perceptible is a questionable proposition, I think, as long as it is taken to mean that the visible is already there waiting to be distributed and then redistributed in another aesthetic political arrangement. If we could move on, okay, again, this is not a perfect example. It's a very lame example, actually. But, okay, one way you can think about a blank page is, sure, you can divide it into various areas in many different ways, but at the end of the day, kind of the size of the page is limited. So you have so and so much space, blank space or blank surface to sort of divide, which I think is very simplistic. So actually, if you just look at a blank page, you might rather try to think about all the possible, whatever, drawings, paintings, writings, whatever could appear on it. Okay, And that's the sort of the idea of the virtual. Okay, so not dividing up what is already there to be divided, but rather this sort of infinite possibility of making this blank page into anything pretty much. Okay, you could actually, even if it's not a digital blank page, but a physical blank page, you could kind of cut it up and do all sorts of things. So since I need to speed up a little bit, so if we could perhaps move on. Oh, okay, that's quite a jump. So before I speak about that. That's what happens. So I would argue that the point of queer critique and queer practices so is not to render divisible, that is to represent a presumably pre-existing community or constituency of intelligible, like easily read pre-existing LGBT subjectivities, but rather the point is instead to render visible, render imaginable what seems to be impossible social arrangements, subject positions, or flows of desire, by exactly playing with invisibility, both visibility and invisibility, intelligibility and unintelligible, blah, 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 blah. So if so here's a nice okay, if we could go back, so here's a nice quote I found, and I was so proud to find something that had actually design in its title, if you see, and it was so much down my alley, this quote. So this rather anarchist sort of theorist says, he also sort of points out, not only in terms of queer activism, but all sorts of other social movements and activisms. He also emphasizes sort of invisibility, obfuscation, imperceptibility, and so on and so on. And okay, if we move on, okay, so there is this okay, to explain why the slide is here. There is this term diffraction and diffractive reading. It comes from physics, basically, even classical physics, although it's also present very much in quantum physics. And it has become it has been used recently more in the humanities as diffractive reading. There is this practice of diffractive reading. This idea is cherished in sort of feminist/queer new materialism. Okay. So I made a connection there, and of course it was a nice way to get the rainbow in there. Okay, of course, at the same time. So I thought that was rather clever. So that would be mostly it. But yeah, oh my God, there was something behind. There was this virtuality that nobody realized was there, and that's basically my final point, which is strategically speaking, queer critique and queer practices should use both visibility and invisibility.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. So it's your time to present what you have prepared.
So yeah, thank you. So my name is Patryk Sierpowski, and I'm a graduate student of sociology. And in my talk, I would like to focus on social research with social movements. I called it with love and passion in common struggle. And I would like to talk about the methods in the study of social movements, but it won't be focused on, the set of techniques that aim to, extract strictly defined knowledge. Rather, I would like to treat the methods like the collective and material practice that is situated in the politics of academia and also of social movements. And although it can seems that the topic is limited to social movements area, I think that it outlines the broader context of understanding of knowledge production in academia, in conventional academia. And this knowledge production that excludes generally multiple lived experiences and alternative knowledges that are inherently connected with them. So I will talk about material and discursive practices in academia that establish this space of exclusion in knowledge production. And I will root in the topic of activist research. So using it, I will present possible cracks and also strategies that can overcome above-mentioned politics, and also use them to uncover alternative epistemologies and ontologies of knowledges. And what is important, I treat activism not as another, area to be researched. Rather, I treat activism as an area of knowledge production that is as important and as right, like the knowledge that is produced in academia. So I think that the core element of such activist research is just the engagement and research process. That is participatory approach to the research, what means generally engaging participants of research process to the whole or to the all stages of research. That is, conceptualization, that is making research, and afterwards analysis of data. And also, in reverse, engagement of researcher in activist practices of social movements. And I think that is the foundational condition of producing alternative knowledge. And it's generally in this approach, it's very connected to material turn, that is rooted in Marxist theories that claim that the prerequisite of theory is just the practice. So if we are engaged in some practices, then the knowledge become more valid. And these there are two, I think, categories used by the conventional academia to construct and to exclude some research practices, that is reliability and validity. And we it's so often risen when we have, for example, researcher that crossed the conventional methodologies, and the engagement in the research process is one of such an element. So I think that it's just like because this using these terms of reliability and validity is just another case of or example of politics of academia. And there is a historical trend of resigning of social engagement and research, in social research and in production of knowledge, that is based generally on either rejecting the engagement or just putting it into not so prestigious subdisciplines like social work. And since the Second World War, there were some approaches like action research or participatory action research that have tried to, take the practice back to the research. But these approaches are also the place of critique, because participatory action research or just action research is often used as an element of hegemonic politics of World Bank, United Nations, or just conventional academia. So if we have this engagement, afterwards we can say also about the utility of the theory that is produced in academia. And it's very connected with this engagement. So there is approach that is called movement relevant theory, that is by Bevington and Dixon. And it's based on the claim that theories produced recently or generally in social movement studies are very unuseful for activists, like resource mobilization theory that generally answers the questions that are well known for activists. So the condition for this approach is just constant dialogue with movement to know their needs and to know questions and problems that are important to them, and to produce the knowledge that can be used by it, by social movement and by activists. So the utility of produced knowledge is just like the condition of quality of knowledge. And there are some problems with this approach, I think, for example, with this very utility of research, because sometimes it can overlooks, for example, value of process and focus only on these very visible effects of research. But on the other hand, it also highlights the self-reflexivity of researcher that is crucial, I think, because it makes the research process firstly politically just, secondly ethical, and also it can help to use academia strategically. For example, use resources provided by academia like time or money given to researchers, and to use it for social movement interests. So it can build like the bridge between activism and academia, and that's very big advantage of this approach. And when I mention this division between academia and activism, I think that it's very very hardly rooted in structural conditions of academia, like, for example, rooting academic careers in agendas and structures constructed or produced by academia or the state policies. Also, the claim that modern or contemporary science should be, like detached observation. Also, it makes the science self-referential. It makes it focused only on itself. What makes, for example, combining work in academia and in activism quite hard to do, because, for example, very rigorous standards of academia just make it impossible. There's also the shortage of money that is quite common in every social science. So this structural context make researchers to perform different strategies to deal with it, and generally it's based on combining or balancing these two roles, like activist and researcher, in different qualities. For example, some persons emphasize this activist role, what results in, for example, can result in exclusion from academia. Some emphasize more academic roles, what results in this distinction between research and social movements. So based on these strategies, we can also distinguish some different approaches to conduct such a research. for example, revolutionary one that aims to, make a very vivid distinction between academia and activism. What they say can provide a space of freedom, freedom of hierarchy, elitist hierarchy of academia. But on the other hand, it also limits the social change only to some very limited spaces that are, contrary to academia. And on the other hand, we can also distinguish some approaches that combine these two worlds, like using, for example, cracks and freedom in academia, like in above mentioned movement relevant theory approach. And it can use academia and also use activism and make new quality alternative approach generally to the social change. And what is quite important, this binarism of activism in academia is not only structural in terms of this macro or meso perspective I have just mentioned, but it's also discursive one. For example, treating scientific knowledge as transparent, verifiable, repeatable, or having critical distance is just like another dimension of politics of academia that try to present this knowledge as the only right. But generally, looking at it more critically, it just try to produce knowledge. This discursive dimension just can be looked quite critically, and we can see that this knowledge is just mystifying, non-subversive, and also elitist. So these arguments of objectivity of knowledge are just another part of political or of politics of academia to reproduce the current system of power implemented in academia. So this activist approach offers more visible and distinct approach, so more visible and distinct subjects or model of producing knowledge. So we are not hiding, we do not hide beyond the title of objective researcher. Instead of this, as for example situated knowledges by Donna Haraway can be an inspiration to this, we distinctively outline our position that is situated in the relations of power, and make knowledge that is not that is not for interest of academia, but for interest of community, of social movement, etc. So as you can see, this distance or just engagement is core axis of critique of methodologies of social movement or in social movement studies. So heading to the main point of my talk, that is activist or militant research. I would like to outline some conceptualizations of knowledge or knowledge production that offer us quite alternative view of them, like one described by Greenwood that uses Aristotelian distinction on episteme, techne, and phronesis. So episteme is this detached knowledge produced in homogeneous groups in academia. Techne is more like the knowledge that is produced to solve problems, and it uses the ideal ideal model that is it just creates on its own, and the social sciences has been just based on these two knowledges, so episteme and technia, whereas phronesis was just excluded, and phronesis is a knowledge that brings practice back to the academy, and brings also everyday experience back to the academy. So it's not like another construct, but it's a lived experience that is built on a democratic process of common learning. And on the other hand, we have, for example, conceptualization by Dana Dedosk, that is method of the body, that is contrary to the method of the eye, what we can equate with episteme, and is also contrary to method of the voice, that is focused on subjugating representation. And instead of it, method of the body departs from this binarism of subjectivity and objectivity, or theory and practice, and offers an approach that is focused on details, on interdependencies, on embodied experience that is performed by power or relations of power. And these two conceptualizations can be quite helpful to understand the approach that is militant research. Militant research or activist research is practice, reflective, practical work to co-create knowledge, especially focusing of these knowledges from periphery. So it's the practice that is focused on organizing, and because of this highlights on engagement and organizing, and blurs the very common distinction on researchers and research, also as it blurs the distinction on interior and exterior, because in practice we are something like the common phenomena that work together with bodies and with emotions. So this approach is based on critique of academia and of political groups. It's hard to translate this, I think. That is objectualization, and it's the process of attributing the meaning from external point of view. So we have here permanently this emphasis on engagement, on being there with the people. So this immanence, it's called in this approach immanence, eliminates this division on interior and exterior, and also allow to making research that is based on love and friendship. It's called their composition. So this kind of relationships helps to overcome obstacles by academic knowledge production, because it, for example, focuses not on a number of persons, if we say about the validity of knowledge being produced, but
I'm sorry, could you be nearing the end, because we are running out of time? Actually, we have already moved into the discussion timeline. Okay.
Yes, it's the end, and it is focused on the strength of the relationships, and it just allows to do a research that is for for social movements or for community, and is based on or is aimed to emancipation. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your speech. So now let's move to the discussion part. We've got like 12 minutes for the discussion, and then we will have to prepare for the keynote panel discussion. So, any questions to the speakers from the live audience? Okay.
So I have a question for Tomasz Sikora about the distribution of visible, because, well, I have a different opinion about it. I mean, I don't see it as you did, as you presented it as something already there, and I see it more as something that belongs to the paradigm of constructivism. And when you think about the census, it's just an example of the moment when that structure is erupted, is disturbed, and is recreated. So I just wanted to ask you to elaborate about, on your concept, on your idea of the division of the perceptible.
Yes. Okay. I also had a look at the chat, and I saw someone say, "Well, you can't explain Rancière in 4 minutes." Of course, you can't, and of course, I wouldn't dare to. Okay. I didn't actually engage with Rancière very directly, to be honest. My use was a bit instrumental, and also I was rather saying if it's taken to mean. So I was rather actually referring to particular sort of readings of Rancière, that sort of out of which I would find some, a bit oversimplifying, okay, than others. So I wasn't actually either trying to explain that. When I say I used it sort of more instrumentally, it was sort of a good sort of support argument for something that to a lot of people may not be so intuitive in a way, which is how the aesthetic realm and is maybe sort of directly related to the social field and thinking about subjectivities through those, let's call them aesthetic terms, although here they become aesthetic and political sort of at the same time. So, so I'm not sure. Yeah, I know it's a disappointing. You ask about something else, but instead, I'm only sort of saying it's a discussion for a different paper and a different conference, I should think. And I'm aware of the publications on kind of queering Rancière or the use of Rancière in queer theory, and all of this is very, very interesting. And of course, not just it's not the only notion or concept that, of course, Rancière is known for, and you need to look at the whole sort of complex philosophy that he presents. So I was really sort of, I took it out of the toolbox and I used it a bit instrumentally to yeah. So I wasn't engaging with Rancière actually. I'm sorry.
Okay, Professor Sikora, there is another question that you would like to answer. Thank you, Tomek, for your presentation. Justyna writes, I wonder to what extent certain strategies and tactics of queer movements in urban spaces could be regarded as transgressing the binary of visibility and invisibility. I'm thinking, for example, of grassroots stickers, which sometimes appear in surprising spaces, being either overly visible, for example, on a toilet door, or almost invisible, for example, on selected hidden elements of a building facade. I'm curious, what do you think about it?
Oh, it's a it's a great comment, and I've actually when I was in Berlin at one point, I was supposed to be doing research on something else, but I decided to actually walk around the city as much as possible and to look at all the stickers, and I took hundreds of photos, and of course I need to do something with it, to write an article or something. That's an absolutely great example. And of course, many of those stickers were in themselves quite unintelligible. Okay, like really. So I was like, okay, so let me go around and try to find sort of somehow queer, stencils, if you call them that, okay, or stickers. Or sort of little interventions, artistic / activist interventions in city spaces. But then, of course, I ended up sort of really not knowing very often, again, there can be no clear-cut sort of definition, kind of categorization of, oh, okay, so this is queer, this is not. So which is exactly part of what I'm talking about, okay? This visibility, invisibility. Is it even queer?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I've got a question for Patrick, and it's going to be like the very last question at the session. Are you carrying out your own research, and could you actually see the tools you were discussing in your speech actually translating into your own research, like your own material practice? As an activist researcher?
Yeah, so I have currently carried out the research with a climate movement in Krakow. I'm a climate activist also. So it was more like the common experience that was aimed to talk about ideas, because we had an impression that we are so focused on organizing and on work that we have no space to talk each other about more ideational issues. So the problem with it was that firstly, I as a, for example, sociology student, have no traineeship or no training on such an approach that is, for example, participatory one. We have no also in very strict framework of bachelor thesis, because it was I was doing it as a part of my bachelor work. We have no time for such work that is emotional, that is very long, that is focused on relationships. Because, for example, we have only like a month for research. Afterwards, it's analysis, and also not analysis that we do, together with participants, because we have no time for it. So I think that that my experience in such an approach was very influenced by these structural context I have mentioned also in my presentation. So unfortunately, also I have some impression on this emotional context of work that was very hard, because of this combining the role of researcher and activist. And it was very combined with conflicts in our movement. So it was hard, to find a balance between not extracting, but between finding a knowledge that is inclusive and that is focused on our self-emancipation, and between moderating these whole conflicts between people, between their interests that were very different. So I think that this concept of activist research is more like, like a model, and we can just go towards it, but it's quite hard to reach it, especially if we work in this context of, for example, like in my case of bachelor work that is also, you know, constrained by some things.
Thank you. We don't have any time for. Okay, so one short question, but we have to prepare for the next panel.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I wasn't listening carefully, and also the connection is not like the most perfect connection. What really is so militant about this militant research methodology? It's a strong word. Okay, activists, engaging, you know, engaged, whatnot. But militant is a strong word. How would you explain this militant side to it?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because it's, you know, it's term from colectivo situaciones, and they oppose their approach to militant groups. So the militant, I think, is more like the focusing of, or more like highlighting this activist work or this common struggle. It's hard for me to say that it's, you know, like really military work that is that aims to I don't know, reach some very strictly defined goals. Especially that it's, you know, that it's very based on relationships in the research process, that it's very immersed in these love and friendships. So I think that this militant research is just like the concept, especially that we, as I have mentioned, we have this opposition between militant groups that attribute the meaning from external point of view, and militant research that creates the knowledge together in a fight, but in a fight as, you know, the common work of social movement, perhaps also in some context more radical than, for example, in Europe or in context that we know.
Okay, thank you for your speeches. So we are meeting in 15 minutes, and it's going to be a keynote discussion panel titled "Shifting Invisibilities: The Making and Unmaking of the Excluded." So let's meet in 15 minutes.